January 1991, Soviet troops fired on civilians in front of Lithuania's television station. 13 people died. 3 years earlier, the message from Moscow had been different.
We have seen in our past how the people were excluded from the political process. Today, we must use democracy, and we must use a free press to actively involve the people in decision-making.
By 1988, the changes Gorbachev had launched in the Soviet Union had freed its 15 member republics to strike out for greater independence. The steps taken by one of the smallest, Lithuania, were to shake the foundations of the Soviet Empire.
When Gorbachev came to power, it became clear that some things were going to change. And that meant that changes would be possible in Lithuania, too. What was happening in Moscow was inspiring. And we wondered when perestroika would start in Lithuania.
For 50 years of Soviet occupation, Lithuanian national feelings had been suppressed. Now their reawakening inspired a national movement, Sąjūdis. Several high-ranking Lithuanian communists were among its founders.
We started looking for a name. The National Front wasn't quite right. It didn't sound democratic enough. So finally we decided to call it the Lithuanian Sąjūdis, or movement, for perestroika. We used the word perestroika to prevent attacks on us. We wanted our movement to seem close to what was happening in the Soviet Union, to bring it closer to Gorbachev's perestroika.
Algirdas Brazauskas was Gorbachev's choice to replace a hardliner as boss of the Lithuanian Communist Party. In June of 1988, Brazauskas had spoken at a huge rally organized by Sąjūdis to champion Lithuanian rights. The speech won him enormous popularity.
I started speaking about our economic relations with Moscow. I said we should make Lithuania more independent. Then I began to talk about our flag. That was a memorable moment. I said, we have to bring back our flag, and we will.
Brazauskas at the time didn't say anything about seceding. He said all they wanted was economic independence. They wanted a Swedish consulate. I didn't see any problem with that. A Swedish consulate, okay, have a Swedish consulate. Your own flag, all right. Why not your own national flag? If you don't like this flag, have your own national flag instead of this flag.
Gorbachev sent his most liberal colleague, Politburo member Alexander Yakovlev, to Lithuania. The new leaders looked to his visit to define a new relationship with Moscow. They found the encouragement they were seeking.
Alexander Yakovlev certainly did a lot for us then, because he said what was happening here was in fact part of the same process, had the same character as the perestroika announced by Gorbachev. He guaranteed us that we would be safe, and that top leaders in Moscow understood what was happening and what we wanted.
I admit, we had been operating like an empire. The center really did dictate everything to the republics. So I had to agree with them. If I didn't, it would have been sacrilegious. So of course I supported them, and today I still think I was right.
The liberal Lithuanian communists, in response to public demands, returned the main cathedral in the capital, Vilnius, to the Catholic Church and made Lithuanian, not Russian, the official language of the Republic. The radicals in Sąjūdis, led by Vytautas Landsbergis, wanted more than symbolic reforms. They raised the question of Lithuanian self-determination.
We said we had to meet with Gorbachev because we were sure that we represented Lithuania better than the party or the Supreme Soviet. And that led to our meeting with his deputy, Lukyanov.
We talked about Lithuania's desire to manage itself for self-sufficiency, independence, self-government, and we wanted maximum protection. So we talked about protecting the interests of both the Lithuanians and the other nationalities living in Lithuania.
Two things. There were two things they said we couldn't do. One of the things we couldn't do was reject the Communist Party. And the other thing was that we could never give up socialism.
In other republics, national movements had sprung up in response to Gorbachev's rhetoric of change. The first to erupt was the Southern Republic of Armenia.
The first rallies in Yerevan were very open. People were marching for Gorbachev, for perestroika, the spirit of perestroika. There was real hope. People saw it as a new time. Perestroika meant getting rid of what was unfair in our politics, economy, and society. So, with this hope came this wave of new demands. People expected a fair solution to the problem of Nagorno-Karabakh.
Nagorno-Karabakh is a small mountainous area where Armenians have lived under the rule of the Soviet Republic Azerbaijan since Stalin drew arbitrary borders within his empire.
The problem of Karabakh was a grassroots conflict from the ground up. It soon became a problem that the Republic's leaders couldn't control.
Gorbachev agreed to meet with a moderate spokesman for the nationalists.
The situation, the agony, the cries of pain from Karabakh had been ignored for 70 years. Now the top leaders were finally listening. Gorbachev said the Politburo discussed the question for 4 hours and then asked the Secretariat of the Central Committee to look into the situation and give regular reports. Gorbachev said the links between Karabakh and Armenia would be restored. And we believed him, the way we had believed in perestroika when it first started.
Inspired by Gorbachev's calls for change, Armenians demanded control of the region. Violence between Christian Armenians and Muslim Azerbaijanis soon spread from Karabakh to overwhelm both republics. In spite of the threat of nationalism, Gorbachev was on the crest of a wave on December 7, 1988, when he addressed the UN General Assembly in New York. Gorbachev spoke of the changes in Soviet policy he had forged with his liberal Politburo colleagues Yakovlev and Shevardnadze. He talked of real changes at home, the release of political prisoners, the creation of a popularly elected parliament, and made a headline-catching promise to reduce Soviet forces in Eastern Europe.
To guarantee that perestroika will keep moving steadily forward, we must continue to enact real democratic reforms in our whole system of government and power.
Я позвонил в Нью-Йорк I called to New York and asked to speak to Gorbachev. I was told that he was at the podium addressing the UN. I told his security people that as soon as he left, he had to contact me. There was an emergency, and it couldn't wait. 10 or 15 minutes later, he called. Gorbachev was calling from his car, and he asked me what was going on. I explained that there had been an earthquake in Armenia. I told him that the situation was grave, much worse than we had originally thought in Moscow. It was a terrible tragedy. We didn't know how many had died. He said that as soon as we finished talking, he would announce that his visit is over and that he was returning home.
When Gorbachev arrived on the scene, 25,000 people were dead and 500,000 homeless. He expected to find a nation in mourning.
Gorbachev was stunned. There was a man looking for his mother's body among the debris in Leninikon. He turned to Gorbachev and started talking about Karabakh. He was there looking for his mother, unsure whether she was dead or alive, but he immediately raised the issue of Karabakh with Gorbachev.
Gorbachev was very afraid and surprised. He said, among all these bodies, how can you still talk about Karabakh? He could not understand how we felt about Karabakh. He thought people had been put up to it.
Even before the earthquake, there were thousands of homeless people in Armenia, refugees from the conflict over Karabakh. The Armenians' fury at Moscow's inaction led to an ugly confrontation with Gorbachev when he returned from the disaster area to the Armenian capital, Yerevan.
He was offended, he was indignant. And Gorbachev said, "Aren't you ashamed? We have just seen all this suffering, all this pain and tears. And instead of thinking about that, you are still carrying on with this obsession."
Karabakh is being used by people who are political demagogues, adventurous, people who mislead the public. They don't like the changes perestroika is bringing to Armenia. And for a long time, they haven't really cared about Karabakh. They're in a struggle for power. Power is all they care about.
Just before Gorbachev left, the Karabakh Committee, leaders of the Armenian national movement, were arrested by Soviet troops who had set up headquarters in the Opera House. Public outrage at the arrests quickly turned Armenian feelings against Gorbachev and the Moscow authorities.
At that point, they didn't understand how serious the Karabakh problem was. It was deeply rooted. They didn't realize that we were dealing with much more than a group of extremists who were making things difficult. The extremists weren't important. They were not the ones who determined what was happening. This issue touched the hearts and minds of all Armenians. It quickly erupted into a mass movement. Everyone joined.
Moscow had picked Suren Aratunian, a colleague of the liberal Yakovlev, to run Armenia. They hoped he would strengthen the local party and undercut nationalism, the same reasons they had chosen Brazauskis in Lithuania. Arutunian, however, came into conflict with the Armenian party's entrenched and corrupt bureaucracy, popularly called the Mafia. The Karabakh Committee had attacked the party Mafia to rally public support for their cause.
In the Soviet Union, the Mafia and the state are linked. And it's more protected here than elsewhere. In Italy or the United States, when you say Mafia, it just means organized crime. So if a senator or a policeman gets involved, it's a huge scandal. But here, in the Soviet Union, it's like this. Mafia, the state, and law enforcement all overlap and add up to the same thing. The criminals are closely connected to the shady economy, and they in turn are connected to the party and to law enforcement. It's all intertwined.
The Karabakh Committee printed a leaflet after the earthquake that said the Soviet government should not be trusted with the money from foreign aid. And so to keep the money out of the hands of the local party mafia, we opened foreign bank accounts so we could run the relief effort. We were distributing the supplies when they arrested us. Even though I was a member of parliament, even though I had legal immunity, they ignored the law and arrested me anyway.
The arrested Armenians were sent to KGB prisons in Moscow and for 5 months cut off from all information.
It was May 3rd. I was having my dinner in prison with the other inmates who were your ordinary criminals. I got this package, and inside this package there was an apple. And I took this apple, and I pulled it apart. And inside there was a piece of paper. I carried this paper with me always. It had news from Armenia written on it. It said our movement was still alive and active, and that the struggle continued. One day they opened the gates. They handed me a document, and it said that I was released from prison. I walked to the nearest metro and went up to the ticket man. I showed him the paper, and I said, I'm a political prisoner just out of prison, just out of jail. I don't have any money. Will you let me travel for free?
The release of the committee followed 6 months of constant Armenian pressure on the Kremlin. Far from weakening the Armenian movement, the arrests had united nationalist forces in the republic. As in Lithuania, a non-communist movement had won the public support needed to begin leading their people away from Moscow's domination. At this moment, in the spring of 1989, the same rebellious spirit echoed throughout the Soviet Union. As he had promised at the UN, Gorbachev created a new Soviet parliament, the Congress of People's Deputies. In the closest thing to free elections ever held in the Soviet Union, a surprising number of hardline communists were ousted by democratic candidates. The largest anti-communist vote had come from Lithuania. Almost all of their deputies were from the nationalist group Sąjūdis. The voices from street rallies around the republics were about to be heard inside the Kremlin.
On the eve of the first Congress, the atmosphere was extremely tense. We wanted things to go as smoothly as possible, but instead, we had an uproar.
Gorbachev sought powers that would enable Moscow to reverse many new laws that were being passed by republics seeking self-rule.
We opposed this because it would have given them a chance to strangle the republics from the center. By the time we and the other republics had adopted these constitutional amendments, Gorbachev said the amendments were illegal, so they had to be repealed.
After the debate, Gorbachev had enough support in the Congress to win the vote, but things didn't go according to plan.
61 delegates abstained.
Right. Decision taken.
From the Lithuanian Republic, 50 delegates did not vote.
The next move by the Lithuanian delegation stunned the Congress. All 50 abstaining deputies walked out.
Comrades, please keep calm. It's not that simple. Let's not jump to conclusions.
I was sitting up on the platform. The walkout by our delegates put me in a very difficult position, and I had to decide what I should do. I was really put on the spot. Gorbachev called me over and told me to go out and speak to them.
Brazauskis failed to persuade them to return. The proceedings in the hall came to a standstill.
Gorbachev and I went to speak to the Lithuanian delegation to prove to them our position. It was really a very serious situation.
We had to explain that we were not demanding anything. They could all vote however they wanted. I just explained why we were not going to vote, why we wouldn't take part.
We talked then just about restoring Lithuanian sovereignty. Not independence, just sovereignty. Our main goal was still sovereignty.
Our position was clear. We had to defend Lithuanian interests, not make laws for the Soviet Union.
When we mentioned sovereignty, Gorbachev joked, well, maybe someday, when time has passed, we'll welcome you and roll out a red carpet. But for now, let's just talk as people's deputies and stick to the rules.
In any case, we wanted to come to some kind of agreed solution, a consensus, an agreement where we could invite the delegation back, so we could work together at the Congress.
This showed a new, highly significant stage of conflict. It was just starting, and I knew it would get a lot worse. It was going to be an acute struggle. I was very worried.
His move toward independence was to receive an unexpected boost from the collapsing communist regimes in Eastern Europe. As Gorbachev arrived in Berlin for the 40th anniversary of the state of East Germany, thousands of its citizens were fleeing to the west. But the celebrations went ahead. The old order maintained its usual style.
I remember also the crowds in German Democratic Republic. There was such a country last year. And we were there in October 1989, celebrating 40 years of this country. I remember the volume I was presented by the government, color photos and everything, showing great success this country had during 40 years of its existence.
Behind his smiles and kisses, Gorbachev had a sobering message to deliver. For more than a year, hardline regimes in Eastern Europe had proved an embarrassment to him. German party boss Erich Honecker had even interfered with Glasnost, the most prized of Gorbachev's achievements. At one point, Honecker tried to stop the printing of a play in a leading Soviet magazine.
Honecker wrote a letter to the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party complaining that I was going against the party line, that I was an anti-communist, an anti-Soviet editor. So, my position was very shaky.
The publication of this play had provoked such a sharp attack from Honecker that the editor was called before the Central Committee.
I stuck to my guns and said, this play, which is on in our theaters, is not anti-communist or anti-socialist. I don't agree with Honecker. And in the party, there were already influential people who thought it was unacceptable that Honecker should be dictating to the Soviet press from Berlin.
I remember when he was in Berlin, Gorbachev had 2 meetings with Honecker. I was there. He very gently but firmly let Honecker know that the GDR had to change. He did not use a single harsh word. He did not say you're conservatives or reactionaries. He just said, look at the situation in the world. Everything is changing. We can't afford to go on acting the way we used to.
This warning came amidst a grand display of the might of Honecker's regime. All the Eastern Bloc leaders were in attendance, including Romania's Ceausescu. At one point, he suggested to Gorbachev that they use the might of the Warsaw Pact to crush anti-communist risings that were threatening their regimes.
Gorbachev said vehemently, rule that out. That will never happen, never again. We will never agree to that. Every nation must choose its own destiny. At one point, Ceausescu even wanted to intervene in Poland, alone, without us. He believed that recent changes in Poland and Hungary were a revolutionary infection. But Gorbachev, in no uncertain terms, warned Ceausescu against any action.
As Gorbachev left, demonstrations spread through East Germany. Honecker and other hardliners refused to read the writing on the wall.
They just could not believe that we'd let things take their course. I had to keep telling them that we wouldn't interfere. I told them, base your plans on this understanding. Remember, although our troops are there, they will not be used against you.
I cannot tell you how many sleepless nights I spent. I had been creating this security system myself, and it was just collapsing right then and there.
We gave strict orders to our troops not to leave the barracks. Certainly not to go shopping or anywhere else, just sit tight, so they wouldn't get dragged into any kind of provocation.
No one expected events to move as quickly as they did. Within weeks of Gorbachev's visit to Berlin, the wall came down, and the Cold War seemed to end on live TV. Some members of the Soviet Politburo watched with the same disbelief as the rest of the world.
When I saw what was happening on television and read about it in the papers, I knew that it wasn't just the Berlin Wall that was collapsing. It was our whole system. All the chiefs of staff, all the military leaders in the Warsaw Pact, they were all our friends. We had lived and worked together for years, and we still had some common interests. And now, these abrupt changes were forcing them to leave. Forever. Of course, we were all very upset.
That part of history, no matter how pleasant it might have been for some, is gone. It cannot be brought back. We certainly won't be trying to bring it back.
We lost the Warsaw Pact, while NATO got much stronger. The position of capitalism in Western Europe grew stronger, and we withered away.
What are the accusations? The accusations about Eastern Europe. That we lost Eastern Europe. We are charged with allowing the Germans to unite. We are also being accused of withdrawing our troops. I was involved in all those decisions, and I'm proud of that. Yes, proud. There was no alternative if we wanted to become a civilized nation.
The setbacks for communism outside the Soviet Union sent a clear message back home. The party could be removed from power. The Lithuanian party boss Brazauskas hoped to prevent the collapse of his party by asserting its national identity and splitting away from the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. In December 1989, he called a special Congress.
I was called to the phone in the middle of a session. It was Gorbachev. He said, "Surely you didn't make this decision." I said, "Yes, we did. We made the decision yesterday."
The Lithuanians had voted overwhelmingly to go their own way.
Gorbachev said, "Then at the earliest opportunity, we'll call a central committee meeting to discuss what you've done and reverse your decision." I said, "That's up to you."
2 days later, on Christmas Eve, the Lithuanian leader came to Moscow to face a special session of the Soviet Party's Central Committee. But first, he went to see Gorbachev, alone.
On the eve of the meeting, I asked to see Gorbachev, and I went to his office in the Kremlin. He was sitting there preparing his speech, which, as it turns out, was extremely harsh. And he looked up at me as I came in, and I understood from his look that this was difficult for him, too. And he said, "Now look what you've done. You forced me to do this. I'm going to have to criticize you in front of the whole party."
I thought Brazauskas was right, and we should defend him, not expel him from the party. And I wanted to put pressure on the conservatives, the right-wingers, who were being far too aggressive.
Well, it must have been obvious to them we couldn't call another Congress, couldn't recall our decisions and say, "No, we're not an independent party." I mean, we couldn't rejoin the Soviet Party. We had no reverse gear in this car. We had to go forward.
Mikhail Gorbachev took matters into his own hands. The Lithuanians politely greeted the first Soviet leader ever to visit their republic.
I said we had to greet him politely, since he was the leader of a neighboring country. And we wanted to have friendly relations with that country. So no rude remarks should be made, because that might upset another state. This somehow got to him. And he said it was unacceptable that he was being referred to as a foreign leader. Gorbachev stepped out of his car and went up to the people to shake hands, and the people simply told him that they didn't want to be within the Soviet Union.
We don't want more rights. We want true independence. Who made you write that?
I did it myself.
You've written here full independence. Does that mean you don't want to be part of the Soviet Union?
Sooner or later, yes.
You've thought about this? You're sure?
Of course. Of course we've thought about it.
You're absolutely sure.
I remember when we were going to the airport that last evening after the meeting with our Central Committee. The mood of the people had really gotten to him, and he saw the truth with his own eyes. He said, well, now I understand. I understand you, and I understand what you're going through. I didn't record what he said word for word, but I can't say Gorbachev was in a good mood when he left.
Gorbachev finally understood the situation. He said that Lithuania would be the first to taste independence, and said the taste wouldn't be too sweet. And when we were parting, he took my hand and said, well, my friend Kazimiera, we'll probably meet somewhere on the international circuit. It was kind of a joke, but maybe a hint too, his way of saying he knew what was going to happen.
Soon afterwards, local elections were held in many national republics. Lithuanians defiantly elected a Sąjūdis majority to their parliament on a platform of independence that would end communist rule. In Moscow, the largest demonstration since 1917 demanded the same thing for the whole Soviet Union, that the Communist Party must relinquish its hold on power. As the party grew weaker, Gorbachev proposed a new position for himself.
We had been against the introduction of the post of president as the one ruler of the state, and we had very good reasons for that. But as the situation grew worse, passions were mounting, and it became clear that we needed one man in charge. Gorbachev hesitated to agree at first. He knew what an enormous responsibility it was.
The Congress of People's Deputies reconvened on March 10, 1990, to decide whether to create the office of Executive President, and if Gorbachev got his way, to vote him into the job.
The entire week before, there was a series of discussions among the Sąjūdis representatives to the Congress. We were deciding how to act, whether we should declare independence at once or should go step by step. Many of us had been elected Union deputies to the Moscow Congress. Now, we had to decide as Lithuanian deputies whether we should remain Union deputies, just to keep an eye on what Congress was doing in Moscow.
The Lithuanians decided to stay at home, but liberals from other republics spoke for them at the Congress and warned that too much power in one man's hands could lead to repression.
We are discussing the presidency at a time of crisis, when the policies of the present leadership are on the rocks. Some think we can solve everything by using force. First, we had to decide the aims and functions of the president. Otherwise, we would just be giving one person raw power.
Gorbachev's effectiveness as a leader was on the line. He scrambled to get the new measure passed. Every vote counted.
During the break, another deputy and I went up to Gorbachev. In his
big Ukrainian bass voice. He said, "Mikhail, I would support you. But my voters are flatly against electing you as president at the Congress." And Gorbachev flew off the handle. I'd never seen him like that. He said, "Fine, to hell with your voters. Don't vote for me then." And then he walked off.
That night, before the crucial vote could be held in Moscow, an emergency meeting was called in Vilnius.
The night before, on March 10th, we needed to act quickly according to plan. We had promised our voters independence. Our hand was being forced by the events happening at the Congress in Moscow, where the deputies were voting to give Gorbachev presidential powers. We knew this could bring unforeseen consequences for us.
Some said we were moving too fast. Why are you hurrying? They said that our rush to independence was foolish and would be rejected by Moscow. On the other hand, the people in Saujus and others who were even more radical than Saujus said, "We need to act now, quickly." They said it's now or never.
The parliament in Vilnius declared Lithuania an independent and sovereign state. Though still leader of Lithuania's communists, Brazauskas was now alongside Sąjūdis in pressing forward. Within the week, Gorbachev won his vote and became Soviet president. Within a month, he tried to force Lithuania's submission by imposing a blockade. Within a year, the Soviet tanks moved into the streets of Vilnius. In June 1990, Mikhail Gorbachev went to a reunion of classmates at Moscow University. Among friends, he could reveal his fears.
Everything has been so much more difficult than we imagined in 1985. This machine we've created, we're all caught up in it, and it's running away with us. It's so hard to protect what our fathers and grandfathers achieved. I can't go against that. I can't go against my own grandfather.
Both his father and grandfather had been active communists. His fellow students understood Gorbachev's concern. He feared he was presiding over the end of the communism they had all believed in. For all the smiles, they knew that his revolution was going out of control.
The next months or year will be decisive. It will decide what the country will be like for the next decade, or maybe the next century, which republics will be with us, and what sort of relationship we will shape with them. Everything is at stake. Everything.
In the spring of 1990, Boris Yeltsin, the party maverick, championed by radicals, was seeking election as chairman of the parliament of the Russian Federation. If Yeltsin became head of the largest republic, he threatened to challenge Gorbachev's power as president of the whole Soviet Union.
When the time came to elect the chairman of the Russian Supreme Soviet, big-time games were played by the party bureaucracy and leadership.
The general atmosphere before the election was very tense. So much so that many of us on Yeltsin's side, deep in our hearts, didn't believe he could win. The majority was against him. We'd meticulously calculated everything, and the Democrats only made up 35%.
The initial scramble for deputies' votes produced a stalemate. Gorbachev, though not a member of this parliament, decided to intervene and made a speech.
He never actually said that Yeltsin shouldn't be elected, but his speech didn't leave any doubt. Afterwards, the deputies ambushed Gorbachev and asked him what he was doing. They said, "You don't attack other candidates, but you just picked on Yeltsin. It's wrong to treat candidates differently. We might elect Yeltsin. Why are you risking your credibility?"
One of the deputies secretly recorded an impromptu confrontation with Gorbachev. In that showdown, Gorbachev declared he was strongly against electing Yeltsin as chairman of the Russian Federation.
Gorbachev was vehemently against me being chairman. More than that, the night before the elections, when he was going to Canada, he gave strict instructions to 250 communist deputies to do everything to stop my election. It was a real hatchet job. No holds barred. Anything to prevent me from being chairman of the Russian Federation.
Even those Siberian delegates who did not support Yeltsin and didn't care who they voted for objected to being manipulated by Gorbachev. So, out of sheer Siberian obstinacy, they decided to support Yeltsin.
On the day of the election, Gorbachev left for Canada.
Gorbachev never got the news on the telephone. We were sitting together on the plane, having lunch, when the information arrived.
My attitude toward Gorbachev is not confrontational. We must have discussions and talks. But I will not go against the interests of the Soviet Union.
Gorbachev said, "Well, Yeltsin's been elected. The only thing I can say is that we're going to have to negotiate with him. I won't bear grudges. I'll negotiate with him based on the need for cooperation between the President of the USSR and Chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Federation."
He may still be one of the political giants of our times, but it was a much more vulnerable Mikhail Gorbachev who arrived here today.
Mr. Gorbachev, are you worried about the election of Mr. Yeltsin? If he is indeed playing a political game, then we may be in for difficult times.
Of course, I ruined his good mood there in Canada and later again in the United States.
Yeltsin's victory was not Gorbachev's only headache.
Великое революционное учение Маркса, Энгельса, Ленина. Ура!
For over 70 years, May Day had been the celebration of party power. May Day in 1990 turned into a further embarrassment for the man who had given the people the chance to demonstrate. Crowds protested, accusing the government of being criminal and yelling for Gorbachev's resignation. The party, its leaders, and communism were no longer sacrosanct.
It is symbolic. They not only left the mausoleum, they lost the moral right. Not all of them, but majority of them lost the moral right to govern this country.
Such demonstrations of the breakdown of the Communist Party's authority played into the hands of Gorbachev's opponents. He needed a mandate from the party to continue his revolution. But this Congress also provided a platform for enraged conservatives to call a halt.
The Congress was much more conservative than we expected, and I believe it wasn't representative of the true mood of the party as a whole. Local bosses had managed to fix the election for their allies and for themselves.
Delegates refrained from open attacks on Gorbachev himself. Instead, they went for his liberal allies, such as Alexander Yakovlev. In an emotional speech, Yakovlev denounced an article his critics were passing around the Congress.
The article said, "We need a new Hitler, not Gorbachev. A military coup is urgently needed. In Siberia, there are plenty of places waiting for the people who made a mess of perestroika. My name is mentioned. So, my Siberian comrades, now you can expect new prisoners. This is an orchestrated attack."
Conservatives did little to hide their contempt for a man widely seen as too clever for his own good.
Yakovlev's artistry and brilliance are remarkable. Instead of political reports, he delivers literary speeches.
Delegate Lebed's Armed Forces. How many faces do you have?
Frankly, I was bitter. After 5 years, we should be discussing how to proceed. Instead, we had to justify what we had done. Without reforms, the country would have perished. Instead of looking for party unity, for humanity and decency, we were all caught up in hatred.
The buildup of conservative anger finally exploded. Gorbachev was confronted by provincial party bosses at a closed meeting. Away from the TV cameras, the gloves came off.
It was an aggressive meeting on both sides. Both the secretaries of the cities and regions attacked Gorbachev. He fought back just as hard. Someone stood up and said, "Let's stop all this and start over again." It was to the point where either Gorbachev or his critics would have to go.
They said that Gorbachev and his allies were guilty of undermining the Warsaw Pact, of losing the Baltic republics. He was blamed for the collapse of the Soviet Union, the disintegration of the party, for undermining the ideological foundations of the party, for neglecting the interests of the local organizations. So you see, it was a whole list of most serious accusations.
As always, at the decisive moment, Gorbachev put everything at stake. He put his entire prestige and job on the line. He made it clear that if they failed to adopt his line, including abandoning communist economics, then he would resign.
Gorbachev said, "Either you listen to me or I'll sit down." The crowd was whispering, they were uncontrollable, and Gorbachev left the podium and sat down. The audience was stunned. It looked like his resignation. And then he seemed to realize the implications of what he was doing. So he came back to the platform and went into battle again. However, as I saw it, he never convinced his audience that he was in control.
The pummeling at the hands of these local party warlords threatened everything Gorbachev stood for.
I can't understand why delegates want to turn the Congress into a courtroom, almost handing out sentences. Comrades, this is barbaric. We have begun such an enormous task, opening up society, opening ourselves to the world, and everyone expects it to be easy. We cannot bring back the past. Dictatorship is not the answer. If anyone has that mad idea, that won't solve anything. We're on the right track. We only need to stick to our guns and avoid any weakness.
It was a very powerful, emotional speech, which brought the Congress to its senses. It looked as if the Congress was going to proceed the way it should. The party wouldn't fall apart into various groups and platforms. If it could agree on an attractive program, it would remain united.
The direction the party now took depended on the fate of Yegor Ligachev. For 3 years, he had plagued every attempt at reform. His determination to regain his position as deputy leader became the next test of Gorbachev's control.
All of a sudden, Ligachev insisted on running for election as deputy leader of the party. That was the most dramatic moment for me. We understood that if he was elected, that it would be a blow against the party, placing it in the hands of the conservatives.
Yes, Gorbachev and I differed on tactics sometimes, but not on strategy. I deeply respect this man. I think I have the right to say this, but at the same time, we did have our differences. I have never held back perestroika. My record speaks for itself. The delegates were given the impression that if I was elected, a split could occur in the party. That if they voted for me, they voted for conflict. But that is a well-known trick. People use all sorts of threats. Conspiracy, plots, splits. There was all that talk about how I plotted in the Politburo. Every time Gorbachev went away somewhere.
Everybody was excited and worried. Many of us didn't sleep at night. In the morning, I was relieved to find that only 700 out of 5,000 voted for Ligachev.
Gorbachev contained the conservative challenge and reasserted his hold over the party. But in Gorbachev's moment of triumph, Boris Yeltsin stole the limelight. With a smirk of satisfaction, the leader's former protege broke the final taboo.
I waited for the right moment. I didn't want to just write a note and leave. I wanted to announce it publicly so that the delegates and the people knew. I cannot simply carry out only the orders of the party. As the head of my republic, I must represent the will of the people. I announced my departure from the party in order to better govern my republic and work with all parties and organizations.
Here in the citadel of power, Yeltsin had committed the cardinal sin. An ex-party boss was rejecting his old comrades and their dogmas. Now, from his independent power base as chairman of the Russian Republic, he could set about reversing 70 years of communism. Five years of half-hearted reform had done little for the Soviet Union, but allowed the creation of small, private enterprises catering to a new breed of men on the make. The reforms had failed to alter the lives of the vast majority still dependent on a centrally planned economy. A meal here costs over 100 rubles. This academic can enjoy one only if someone else pays.
And I get monthly only 230 rubles. So that is some 8-10 rubles per day. So I can't afford myself such a meal. The main problem of perestroika during these recent years is that the majority of the population don't benefit from it. On the contrary, their living standards are falling down.
Perestroika had produced a lot of promises and no sausage. By the summer of 1990, Ligachov's political reputation was being poisoned by economic failure.
Gorbachev started taking a serious interest in economics. He saw the market economy as the only answer. The question was how.
Boris Yeltsin was already one step ahead. He advocated a radical plan for moving straight to a more capitalist market economy.
I showed this proposal to Gorbachev. He became very excited. There were other people around, and he told us to drop everything, and he read it all aloud. Then he said, "Where's the person who wrote it?" I said, "We'll call him immediately." He said, "Get him down here right away." Yeltsin's advisor, Yavlinsky, came 30 minutes later. We spoke about it, and Yavlinsky said, "If you like it, call Yeltsin."
Gorbachev called me while I was on vacation and asked me what I thought. I supported my plan and said it would be hard to combine it with government policy. The government's present program wasn't popular. The people will never accept it.
Yeltsin's plan was a complete rejection of the great Soviet industrial dream. The economy, long dominated by heroic plans and central directives, would be put at the mercy of the open market. Land and industry would be privatized. Over 70 years of communist economics were to be swept away, all in just 500 days.
Gorbachev discussed the plan with me in his office. He told me that he spoke with Yeltsin while Yeltsin was in the Baltics on vacation.
Gorbachev was consulting an old comrade, a man he had relied on to run the economy since the day he came to power.
I said quite frankly that I had very little faith in the whole thing. I had very little faith in this kind of compromise between Gorbachev and Yeltsin. The situation was ripe for conflict.
Gorbachev ignored his prime minister. He sent a group of radical economists to one of the state dachas near Moscow and told them to develop the Yeltsin blueprint into a plan for action.
Gorbachev was on vacation in Crimea, in Yalta. He called me about 5 times a day, asking, how's it going? How's it going? How's it going? I tried to calm him down. I said, we're working. Everything's going fine.
A month later, the economists working on the Gorbachev-Yeltsin plan awaited a visit from the rival government team of Prime Minister Ryzhkov.
The conversation got off on the wrong foot. They wouldn't show us anything. At least not until Gorbachev returned.
My group did nothing to obstruct government policies of the program. Whereas the government, to put it mildly, did its best to undermine our work. We noted in our plan which ministries refused to help. Sovmin, Gosplan, Minfin, and so on.
We said, well, we'll have to comply with the instructions of the Supreme Soviet to submit our proposal on September 1st. You have your own objectives, so get on and do it. Do whatever the president has told you to do. We disagree with most of your proposals. They would lead to the breakup of the Soviet Union. So we said, you stick to your guns, we'll stick to ours. And with that, we parted company.
Gorbachev cut short his vacation and flew back here to meet with the entire group. The meeting went on for about 7 hours, and in the evening I handed the plan over to him. He had obviously studied the documents through the night, and the next morning he asked very competent questions.
Gorbachev and I sat down together, just the two of us, for over 5 hours discussing the text. I looked over his notes, and some of the amendments he believed needed to be made. Basically, he turned it into his own program.
In taking on these radical ideas, Gorbachev was supping with the devil, Boris Yeltsin, who just 6 weeks before had turned his back on the party. At the end of August, for the first time in 3 years, they met for talks.
We regret that such a meeting has been so long in coming. But we're both to blame.
You've been at it for 3 hours.
And that hasn't been enough.
I should say that political and personal conflicts have not prevented us from frank discussions of all the issues.
The two of us genuinely worked together with the economists. And he said, don't worry, I will support that program to the end.
Gorbachev said, you know what? It was easier for me to talk to Yeltsin than it is to talk to many of my own officials.
I don't know whether he sincerely believed in the Stalin program or whether that was a political move on his part. Sometimes Gorbachev gets carried away and enthusiastic about an idea. But I never tried to conceal my own views on the plan. I said from the very beginning that I couldn't accept it. That if it was a matter of putting that program into practice, then he would have to find someone else. I would resign.
I said it was suicide for the government to torpedo this plan. Ryzhkov was very angry at me. And he came right back at me.
The clash between President Gorbachev and Prime Minister Ryzhkov spilled onto the streets. For radicals, this was the moment of highest hope. Gorbachev seemed finally to have committed himself to dismantling the old system. But Ryzhkov and his government, for all their unpopularity, refused to back down.
I asked my opponents how much prices will rise by January 1st. They said, God knows. I said, how can we propose such increases when only God knows and we don't? We can't mislead the people.
The deadline to begin the 500-day plan came and went. Nothing happened.
Later, Gorbachev was accused of giving in to me. They said I had twisted his arm. I won't deny that I was defending the interests of the government, of the plan I believed in.
Ryzhkov's victory was dressed up as a compromise. The months of arguments had done nothing to fill the shops, and radical solutions had been shelved once again. Officially, a market economy remained the goal, but now the rush to get there was over. Yeltsin felt betrayed. He accused Gorbachev of being an old-fashioned centrist.
We don't need a center like this. We need a new one, like this. Within these limits, we'll listen. But if Moscow issues decrees in these areas, they won't work, because the republics haven't delegated those powers to the center. So we need a center like this, a nice little one.
Acting like a head of state, Yeltsin began signing agreements between his own Russian Federation and other republics, such as the Ukraine. Sovereignty became the buzzword. His calls for greater independence were echoed all over the Soviet Union. But the nationalist dreams often turned into nightmares. Gorbachev had failed to act decisively over the economy. Now he was failing to prevent the Union from breaking up. The chaos horrified conservatives.
The country's in total chaos and we do nothing. We're always behind the times. What's said in here has no effect on what's going on out there.
The colonel represented an increasingly powerful group of deputies called Soyuz. They were determined to preserve the Union and restore a strong central government.
It was clear that Soyuz was backed by powerful forces and groups. We were worried. There was a campaign in the press. They gave the president an ultimatum. Only 30 days to sort things out. Otherwise, they would bring up the question of his retirement.
The situation in the army is completely unpredictable. When the nation is unsettled and there's talk of a coup, I say, no, the army would never go against its people. But we've reached the limit.
In his State of the Union address in November, Gorbachev provided no solutions.
It is clear to us that we should and can solve the problems, whether economic, political, social, or ideological.
For months, the more conservative deputies had accused Gorbachev of losing control. Now, he was losing them.
None of the deputies were happy. The speech was not well received. They said, We know what is going on in the country is one thing. What the president says is another. The president seems totally out of touch.
Both radicals and conservatives savaged Gorbachev's speech. He returned to his newly built home in the Lenin Hills. His aides say he did not go to bed that night.
At 9:30 in the morning, Gorbachev called me from his car. He was on his way to the Supreme Soviet. I was in my office. He said, "I'm going to announce a proposal calling for radical changes." I asked, "What kind of radical proposals are you going to make? When are you going to make them?" He said, "Right now, at 10 o'clock.
His liberal ally, Alexander Yakovlev, was given no warning.
He never asked my advice. I knew what he was planning to say during the State of the Union address, but not this speech. I wasn't even present. I was here in my office.
Gorbachev called for new presidential powers, which would allow him to rule by decree, almost like a czar. He claimed this was the only way to hold the Union together.
I am firmly against the fragmentation of the state, the redrawing of territories, or the age-old ties between people. I have to speak out. Now that I've seen the blood of our people flow, we, the Soviet people, cannot break apart.
Gorbachev was telling conservatives what they wanted to hear. The army now loomed, an ominous presence at home. The end of the Cold War and the destruction of the Warsaw Pact had left them without a role. The scapegoat was the unrepentant foreign minister Edward Shevardnadze.
I hope my military colleagues don't get offended. But let's face it, in the past, the country was prepared to fight everyone. America, China, Japan, Western Europe. We were living in a dream and drove the country to bankruptcy.
If Gorbachev hadn't supported Shevardnadze, we wouldn't have achieved such changes in foreign policy. And a great deal was achieved. So Gorbachev did support him. But in recent months, under pressure from internal problems, that support began to wane. In fact, it almost disappeared.
Shevardnadze had long identified the future of perestroika with Gorbachev. In the spring of 1990, he spoke of his fears.
If we don't introduce real democracy, a dictator definitely will appear. And we'll have a dictatorship. I see no other future. So we must protect and nurture and strengthen our democracy. And we must support those who will fight for it, especially Gorbachev, who began this revolution.
On December 20th, 1990, Shevardnadze was due to deliver a major report on foreign policy.
This may be the shortest, the most difficult speech of my life.
Since his spring interview, the balance of forces had tilted sharply.
A dictatorship is coming. No one knows who it will be or what this dictator will do. No one knows what sort of order there will be. I would like to announce I'm resigning. Don't interrupt. Let me finish. Don't shout at me. Let that be my protest against the coming dictatorship. Personally, maybe I agree with my critics. Maybe I let Gorbachev down. Maybe. But perestroika and democracy are more important than our friendship, even though we've been friends for decades.
Of all the comrades with whom Gorbachev had set out in 1985, Shevardnadze was the last to go. His early ally, Yegor Ligachev, had turned opponent and been forced out. Nikolai Ryzhkov, now a prime minister without power, suffered a heart attack. Gorbachev's liberal conscience, Alexander Yakovlev, faded into the shadows. With Shevardnadze's resignation, Gorbachev stood alone. The prophecy of approaching dictatorship was to be tested in Lithuania. The new nationalist government had already declared independence. They rejected Moscow's control and boycotted the Soviet parliament. For months, conservatives in Moscow had called for action. Now, Gorbachev allowed the generals to call the shots.
The military preparations were obvious. New and special units of paratroopers were sent to Lithuania. When you consider that the war in the Persian Gulf was expected to break out, we knew there would be war in two places at the same time, and that the war in the Gulf would overshadow the aggression in Lithuania.
Special forces, directly responsible to Moscow, took over a number of public buildings. Shots were fired and civilians injured. Gorbachev accused the Lithuanian government of inviting the crisis, but he promised his troops would act with restraint.
On the third night I went home, because I was told it would be quieter, and I wanted to sleep in my own bed. But I didn't even get a half-hour's rest. I only had time to get into the bath when the phone rang, saying the tanks were moving. I tried to call President Gorbachev in Moscow. His aide answered the phone. He said President Gorbachev could not be reached. He couldn't come to the phone. I told the aide to tell the president that the army tanks are attacking the unarmed people. I asked him to tell the president to stop the tanks immediately.
On Sunday, Gorbachev called. I told him about the events in Lithuania. He had a totally different story. He said he didn't know about the tanks. He had been told his troops acted in self-defense, that separatists and extremists had attacked first and his troops responded. He thought only 2 had died. Well, I already knew that 12 had died.
In fact, 13 had died. The next morning, Marshal Yazov, the Minister of Defense, reported on events.
Gorbachev and I had arranged to meet at 11 on Monday. While I was in his reception room, I watched the TV monitor, which showed the Supreme Soviet and the report by Yazov. The main reasons for the crisis
are well known. They are the government of Lithuania. They use democratic slogans, but they are imposing a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. They attack the workers' state, in particular, the role of the army. So when I went into Gorbachev, I told him what I'd been watching. He was about to go there and speak. I said, I believe that he had to remove himself from everything. He told me, let's finish our business. I haven't seen anything. I'll decide what to say later. So you see, he didn't take my advice.
At about 12 noon today, I had a conversation with the chairman of the Lithuanian Republic, Landsbergis. It was very unproductive. Frankly, speaking from this conversation, I'm getting the impression that it will be very difficult to carry on a dialogue while such people are heads of republics.
Gorbachev expressed regret for the killings, but promoted one of the responsible ministers. Within weeks, troops were patrolling the street of Moscow and other big cities, ostensibly to combat rising crime. Yeltsin claimed the dictatorship Shevardnadze had predicted was beginning.
In 1987, I warned that Gorbachev lusted after power. Now he has a dictatorship with a pretty name, presidential rule. I cannot support the president and his policies, and I call for his immediate resignation.
I know all about Yeltsin. I know him. I just want people to see him for what he is. He's not holding a serious or intelligent dialogue. It's all desperation. That's all.
Meetings, rallies, hunger strikes, calls for disobedience, calls for disbanding the Supreme Soviet and Congress, and for the president to resign. These are not democratic methods, and they can lead to a repeat of the 1917 revolution and put the country on the brink of civil war.
The coup that almost toppled Mikhail Gorbachev last August was preceded by 3 clear warnings. The first of these came in March. Boris Yeltsin was under threat. Hardline communists arranged a special session of the Russian parliament to remove him. Yeltsin responded by calling for mass demonstrations on its opening day.
On March 26th, 2 days before the session, Interior Minister Pugo called all of his deputies in. We were given an assignment to bring all of the available police, including our Interior Ministry troops, into the center of Moscow.
The task of the troops was to enforce a presidential ban of all demonstrations issued by Gorbachev himself.
Special attention has been drawn to the decree forbidding unlicensed demonstration and manifestation in the city. This is for the protection of public welfare during the period of these important political events.
When I got up in the morning, the first thing I noticed was the streets between the hotel and the Kremlin had been emptied of demonstrators. The next thing I noticed was that Red Square was full of policemen. There were trucks filled with police and the special forces who had occupied all of Moscow Center.
50,000 troops and police blockaded the Kremlin, where the Russian parliament was meeting.
This was naked intimidation of the Democratic bloc in Parliament, and we, the Democratic deputies, demanded that the Parliament not open until the blockade of the Kremlin was lifted. Then the Speaker, Kazbulatov, went to see Gorbachev.
I was asked by Yeltsin, who was chairing this session, to carry out the negotiations with Gorbachev for the immediate removal of troops. I spent 40 minutes trying to convince him. I said, Mikhail Sergeyevich, you see the anger on the streets. It's a blow to your authority. You see this was a mistake.
When Khasbulatov returned, he told the parliament about his meeting with Gorbachev.
On the questions of pulling the armed forces off the streets and squares of Moscow by the end of today, the president was uncompromising.
Despite the massive military presence, the crowds defied the presidential ban. This was the moment when Yeltsin and his supporters demonstrated that the people would back them in the streets. In the Kremlin, Gorbachev's oldest liberal ally urged him to withdraw the troops.
I told him, Mikhail Sergeyevich, think about it. Do you know what will happen if somebody gets killed? Think about the funeral. All of Moscow will come out. The factories will stop. That, I think, made quite an impression on him. He didn't say anything for a long time, and then he said, all right, I'll have a word with the ministers of defense and interior and the head of the KGB and tell them to make sure things don't get out of hand.
It was only on the following morning when the troops left, or in any case, when they were out of sight, that the parliament resumed its work.
This retreat was a victory for Yeltsin. Instead of firing him, the Russian parliament confirmed his leadership, and he seized the moment to put himself up for popular election by the Russian people. Within 6 weeks, Yeltsin was to become the first leader in Russian history to be directly elected. Yeltsin's Russia was now pulling away from the Soviet Union, leaving Gorbachev less and less able to govern. Gorbachev's response was a surprise. He invited the leaders of all of the republics to a summit at his weekend residence. For the first time, independence for the republics was at the top of the agenda.
I called Yeltsin during one of his trips and told him that we'd made a tentative agreement to attend and that he should come to Moscow right away. At first he said, we should take a hard line about that. We've developed our own policy. Won't attending mean abandoning our principles? It took a long time to convince him. I told him that it was to be a summit between the leaders of the republics and Gorbachev alone, and it wouldn't look good to skip it.
Gorbachev certainly did rethink a number of his positions and came to the conclusion that we radicals were his only option. And so he could cooperate with our democratic movement, the workers' movement. That's why the meeting on the 22nd became possible and why we were able to sign a joint declaration. At that time, there was a lot of suspicion and mistrust from both sides. It was a shaky truce rather than an agreement, and still a long way from a union treaty.
When this agreement was signed, everyone saw that it was a serious concession on the part of the central administration. From that point, the reactionaries began to attack Gorbachev as well.
Gorbachev's compromise with Yeltsin and the leaders of the republics to change the Soviet Union outraged the hardline communists.
In our meetings, we told Gorbachev to his face that his agreement with the Republican leaders would be nothing less than a junta, to replace our legitimately elected legislatures. Gorbachev didn't have an answer to that.
This group of deputies quickly decided the declaration statement was an encroachment on their rights. They looked at the statement and then made widely publicized attacks that it would mean the breakup of the Union and the appropriation of legislative functions by the executive, and so on.
But Gorbachev remained at his summer residence negotiating with the Republic leaders. He missed the opening of the Supreme Soviet, leaving it in the hands of Speaker Anatoly Lukyanov and Prime Minister Valentin Pavlov.
We had to open the meeting at 10 o'clock, and we met in the back room of the Supreme Soviet Hall, inside the room of the Presidium. It was then that Speaker Lukyanov told me Prime Minister Pavlov was asking for more powers.
There are moments when, excuse me, the decision has nothing to do with the president. We just cannot do everything via the president. I'm sorry, it's just technically impossible. And so the government now needs the necessary powers.
If the government, the cabinet, had received these powers, it would have been able to adopt any kind of a decision.
Have you agreed on this with the president?
Well, I'll be open about this. No, I have not.
Do you have differences over economic and social policies with the agreement with the president?
I think I've answered that question.
It soon became clear that this was a coordinated attack on an absent president.
We felt that something had to be done. It was the president's behavior that made the Supreme Soviet most angry. He asked for more and more powers and then did nothing with them. It was a tragedy for Pavlov and for Lukyanov and for all of us who realized where the country was heading.
We must support the Prime Minister's request for more power. He and his cabinet are trying to preserve our Soviet state.
Some of the deputies called for a closed session of the parliament. We asked the press to leave, and it was then we listened to the statements of the three ministers, Pugo, Yazov, and Khrushchev.
The speech by KGB head Khrushchev was secretly recorded by one of the deputies.
I would like to take advantage of this closed session to tell you what the KGB thinks of the situation in the country. The reality is that the fatherland is on the brink of catastrophe.
Khrushchev read us a secret document which dated from the early or mid-70s. I don't quite remember.
The KGB has reliable evidence that the CIA has a detailed plan to subvert senior figures in the Soviet establishment. They were to be trained and then promoted to key posts in politics, economics, and science.
After that document, I started to change my opinion of some people. I'm not saying I saw them all as foreign intelligence agents, but in light of that document, the strange behavior of some of our leaders and their advisors made me begin to wonder if they were part of the plot.
There was a powerful group of deputies who were insisting that Pavlov's demand for more power be put to the vote immediately.
I insisted on an immediate vote. At that moment, there was a chance we might have found a way out of the crisis and avoided a lot of the unpleasantness which came later.
The hall was in an uproar with deputies demanding that Pavlov's demand for extra powers be put to vote. It was an outcry in the hall. 3 to 5 deputies at every microphone insisted on a vote. Since the president of the Supreme Soviet and the national president were absent, I refused to put that proposal to vote.
I went to see Gorbachev. I asked him, have you heard what's happened? And I told him in exact detail. He was shocked. How could it happen, he asked. He was particularly surprised by the statements by Khrushchev and Pavlov.
He realized it was a personal attack. And I remember he said, look how far they've gone. It's a frontal assault now. With friends like these.
Gorbachev returned to Moscow to address a public session of the Supreme Soviet.
The question before us, as you all know, concerns yesterday's report by the Prime Minister here at the Supreme Soviet.
While Gorbachev did criticize his Prime Minister in his public speech, he treated the incident as a tempest in a teapot. In private, though, he was less forgiving.
In the break between sittings, I was in the Presidium room. Gorbachev, Yazov, Pugo, Khrushchev, Pavlov, and Lukyanov were there. When I arrived, it was obvious that Gorbachev had been raking them over the coals. They were looking very shifty and kept trying to change the subject. But Gorbachev wouldn't let it go and said to Pavlov and Lukyanov that they had better not try any more tricks behind his back.
Nevertheless, Gorbachev didn't fire Pavlov, Lukyanov, or any of his other ministers.
You know, loyal henchmen, they can make threatening noises, they can be unhappy, but they will never really betray you because they're nothing without you. They're not capable of action without their leader. Gorbachev always believed that.
Over the next month, the threatening noises grew louder. The hardline communist press led a vicious campaign, culminating in the manifesto entitled A Word to the People.
I wrote this, A Word to the People. I put a sheet of paper before myself, and all the things that tormented me, that caused me to cry at night, everything that was related to the destruction of this power and the preoccupations of my compatriots. All these things I decided to use in a sermon of appeal.
Around July 18th, a couple of days before my summer vacation, I had a talk with Pugo in his office. He told me, son, there's a group of important people who are preparing an appeal addressed to the Soviet people.
This appeal to the Russian nation was a direct attack on Gorbachev for bringing the Union to its knees. It called on all patriots to defend the fatherland.
We limited the number of signatures to the minimum. Only 12 signatures, like the 12 apostles.
General Gromov was not the only senior member of Gorbachev's government to sign. The deputy to Marshal Yazov, the Minister of Defense, was also one of the 12. Again, the incident passed. Gorbachev took no action against them. He stayed at his weekend residence working on the Union Treaty with the leaders of the republics. By July, on the eve of his trip to the London Economic Summit, there was good news to report.
The president is going not only as president, a representative of the center, but also with us as representative of the republics and their leaders. We've come to an agreement.
The work was intense. We worked 12-hour days to finish. On the last day, Gorbachev asked us to the table, and we raised our glasses and drank a toast to the fact that at long last, we finished drafting the Union Treaty.
Everything seemed to be ready, and we prepared pens and pencils to sign the treaty. That's why he left on vacation at peace with himself.
Georgy Shakhnazarov went south with his boss and stayed at a nearby dacha.
The last time I talked to him was on the 18th of August on Sunday. After I hung up the phone, I tried to make another call. When I picked up the receiver, there was no dial tone. I picked up my second line, and that one too was dead.
Due to President Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev's state of ill health, and in accordance with Article 127, Clause 7 of the USSR Constitution, from August 19, 1991, the duties of the President of the USSR have been assumed by Vice President Gennady Yanayev.
6 years before, Gorbachev had asked the people to join him and launched a revolution.
You must get closer to the people.
How much closer can I get?
Спасибо. Спасибо. Пожалуйста, Андрей Дмитриевич.
Andrei Sakharov, please speak.
Товарищи,
позвонила девочка.
That means you want to leave the Soviet Union?
Sooner or later, yes. Yes, we do.
Do you understand what that means?
Of course. Of course we've thought about it.
Before Perestroika, we had more power. I don't know anyone in the world who was more powerful than the party general secretary. If I had wanted only power, I wouldn't have started any reform.
Citizens of Russia, in the early morning hours of August 19th, the legal president of the nation was removed from power. No reasons justify his removal. We are facing a reactionary right-wing coup.
The people have been subjected to a crude deception. An anti-constitutional coup has been carried out.